Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this first screencast for Plan 20401 Environmental Policies and Designations. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Ian Mill, and I will be the module coordinator teaching you along with my colleague Dr. Phil Bell. Now, these screencasts will be done for most of the lectures, and they will introduce the topics that we're going to discuss in that week's lecture and ask you to think about some of the bigger questions regarding environmental policy, environmental regulation, how we go about planning for environmental management, and of course how these feed into the designations that we have and how they are managed as well. And so what we'll do in this day first one is just ask some of the big questions which we might be talking about throughout the module. So firstly, we're looking at what does environmental policy and regulation cover? Is it only about things that occur or influence very local ideas, or are they about the big issues as well? So are they about air quality or contaminated water or extreme environmental events? And one thing that we will talk about throughout the module is how these big ideas actually are being discussed in different policy arenas, so be it internationally or nationally or locally, and how different advocates are talking about these things. And just a couple of examples here of how these things might be happening. So how safe is your air? There's been a lot of discussion in the last 12 to 18 months about air quality in London, and particularly about the impacts of poor air quality on the elderly and children, and how banning diesel cars or having more restrictive policies about where cars can and can't go in London might actually improve health. This is linked to issues of economic development, so can trucks and can businesses still prosper, but also about health and inequality, so are people in lower socioeconomic areas being subject to worse health, for instance. And so some of the things that we will talk about here are trying to align these big ideas of environmental policy and regulation with what happens on the ground. And that leads on to the second image here of Newark in New Jersey. So contamination of lead is seen that the city's residents have to use bottled water. Now, this isn't a new phenomenon in the United States. So the city of Flint in Michigan is another example of this happening. But what it does highlight is that there are links between industry and the way in which we manage resources, and the impacts these might then have on local communities. So in this case, if the water is unsafe to drink, how do people cope by buying bottled water? Can they actually afford it? And therefore, what can be done to regulate water quality? And we'll touch on things like the Clean Water Act that the Environmental Protection Agency developed in the 1970s in the US. But also some of these wider issues about things like global climate change and extreme weather, be it through rainfall and flooding or through drought, and the impacts that different forms of pollutants have in this case as well. So what we'll do throughout the module is we'll situate the role that environmental policy or regulation designations plays within these broader global discussions of environmental change, climate, and economic and political understandings of the environment. What we'll also do is we'll talk about why environmental policy is actually important and what impact it has. And just a couple of examples here, one from the UK, one from the US. So we will draw quite heavily on these locations about what will happen in the UK if the UK exits the European Union at the end of October. So a lot of our environmental regulations in the UK, be it about water, beaches, sanitation, are linked to European directives. And there is a fear from many outside of the government that when or if we exit the European Union, we will end up ripping up the rule book, and all these regulations that we've had in place for up to 30 years will be thrown away, and that our water will become contaminated. The way in which we produce products, be it agricultural or livestock, will then become tainted with pollutants. And things like the chlorinated chicken debate is such an example of this. And at the moment, we simply don't know what's going to happen. The UK government has stated that it will just transfer the existing European regulation onto the UK statute books, but they're concerned that that may not happen. And again, in the United States, they're looking at being more productive from fossil fuels, but this also requires a growing leniency in terms of environmental regulation about things like methane and what gases can be released from extractive practices. So again, these are linked to economic development opportunities, they're linked to public health, and they're linked to long-term environmental sustainability. So again, we'll talk through in this module the way in which policy can impact on the short, medium and long-term sustainability of an environment, and how it might affect the economy and how it might affect people. And partly this comes down to issues about who controls the policy, who creates the policy, and who enforces the policy. So two examples here, again, one from the US, one from the UK. So the UK government, for instance, is trying to encourage greater extraction from fracking and other more traditional sort of fossil fuel extraction, things like coal, even though it's not necessarily the most viable economically, whilst also being against wind farms or solar or tidal power for a number of reasons. And this raises some very serious questions about the way in which business and the companies which promote environmental extraction have an influence on central government. So should Quadrilla or other companies be leading the agenda, or should the agenda be led by the Green Party or more environmentally focused groups? And at the moment, it tends to be the former rather than the latter. And again, in the United States, we can see Donald Trump playing a very strong economic development, traditional extraction sort of process in terms of promoting opportunities to dig coal and do more oil extraction. But behind this is a whole series of discussions around his view and his administration's view on climate change and the regulation that they have in place. So their view is by opening up new opportunities for fossil fuel extraction, they can start to diminish some of the protections put in place by the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, to allow greater economic liberalisation of the market. However, in many places such as North Dakota with the pipeline, there are real fears that the extraction that will take place will undermine the environmental security of that area. So within the module, we will talk about the role of politicians, we'll talk about the role of private business and private citizens, we'll talk about the role of experts, which the UK government is not particularly keen on at the moment, and we'll talk about the way in which the public can be engaged or manipulate or force change in environmental policy. And we'll use examples such as the Lake District or even on the field trip in the Peak District to illustrate this. And then, of course, all these things have to be thought of in terms of scale. So we can look at environmental policy at a very local scale. So one example is Sefton Park and Sefton Park Meadows in Liverpool, where areas were earmarked for development for housing and local communities campaigned to have the area saved. And this was a very localised discussion about the value of green space to the city of Liverpool and to certain parts of South Liverpool. But that discussion about whether a resource should be maintained or whether it should be protected in perpetuity can be scaled up to a city or even an international scale. And so, for instance, the current discussions about how and whether money should be put forward to try and stop the Amazon wildfires is a good example of an issue which transcends boundaries. It's not just about one particular nation. In this case, it's about Brazil, it's about Paraguay, it's about Bolivia, it's about Peru from the map there. And what we're seeing here is a global discourse being discussed about the impacts of the wildfires on air pollution globally. And yet the actions is still required to come from the Brazilian government itself, which does not seem to be forthcoming. So one thing that we'll talk about quite frequently is the role of scale and the interactivity of different stakeholders in the development, the focus and the application of environmental policy. And finally, we'll talk quite extensively, and Phil will talk about the role of designations have in these conversations. So we have designations in a number of different sizes, scales, focus and legal protections in the UK, be it areas of outstanding natural abuses or national parks. But again, there are quite significant differences in their levels of protection, the amount of money they get and what they're trying to achieve. So for instance, with national parks, they're areas of rurality that are deemed to be of international importance, be it culturally, aesthetically, ecologically or socially. but there are very real tensions regarding how you manage that and how you ensure that there is an economy that services the local population rather than just people coming in to the areas for tourism. And again, things like areas of outstanding natural beauty, they have a designation to be managed and they have management boards, but the protection that they have in local planning is less than you would see for national parks. So Phil will question the role of these designations and how they all fit together to actually form a suite of options that can be hopefully lead to environmental sustainability across the UK and in other countries. So just to wrap up, this module will take a broad look at who controls environmental policy and what they're trying to do with it, at what scale policy should be enacted. Should it be the local? Should it be the national? Should it be the international? Who funds it and who pays for these things? So should everybody pay for national parks or only those people who visit there? And we will also question what happens when you start to deregulate or to challenge environmental policy. And we'll use examples from the UK at the moment about what might happen post the end of October, and in the United States and India and China, where environmental regulation is quite fluid at the moment. So hopefully this has been a useful introduction to the module. We'll talk about these and other issues. Phil and I look forward to teaching you all over the coming semester, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.